Well, this is funky. Welcome. welcome. This isn't my usual music, because my playlist appears to be taken down, which is fantastic. I actually don't like this one very much because it's very bass heavy. It's very bop, 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 beep, beep, bop. That's my professional take on it. Anyway, hello. YouTube is telling me that I am live to 0 people with 0 views and 0 likes, but that's fine because I have like 10 subs, and I'm pretty sure my family are like 8 of them. So, ooh, sudden change of music. I'm gonna find real quick different music because this kind of isn't great. Oh, is this just the same music I had before? Well, that'll do. So, welcome to Theory. Let me just activate this thing and get the slideshow started. Okay, now I have to go back to OBS, and open my YouTube to here, and we'll get started. There we go. So, let us begin. It's 7:15, or 7:13 at night for me. I've tried to pick the best times for everyone, because I know that British times are weird, and, you know, if I went live at 3 p.m, no one would be able to join, because people are barely awake by that point, especially Americans, and my target demographic is basically Americans. I am recording. Yep, I am recording. Studio mode I'm going to turn off. There we go. And let's just double check I am properly live on the YouTube preview. Perfect. Is my audio fine? Yep. So, I am recording these. I'm going to be video editing them kind of infrequently. I have a lot of projects. So while I'm waiting for people to show up, because people have yet to take seats in class, not that anyone's obligated to turn up, as I say every stream, this is just relaxed. This is just me waffling. I have a degree in film. I have 2 degrees actually in film, which is not that steep of an incline, but still. I love film. It's my passion. Obviously, I want to do it twice. It's what I've worked in. I've always wanted to talk theory, because theory is just kind of really interesting, and I love it. The problem I've had trying to write this PowerPoint presentation is trying to keep everything kind of manageable, because part of the issue I have is that I tend to go on tangents, and I need to research a lot of my facts before I throw them in. So one of the things I was doing literally 10 minutes before stream was just going through my just my stuff and just making sure that it's all correct. Now, there is a bit towards the end where I threw it in hastily because I was meant to throw it in before, but it's about Soviet montage. So if you joined for the film practical course last Friday, about 3 days ago, 2 days ago, something like that, you may have heard me talk about stuff like the French New Wave and Surrealism and the Soviet montage, and I briefly covered kind of Vsevolod and Sergei Eisenstein there, and I think I mentioned Balash. Today we're going to talk about that. We're going to discuss a lot of early 20th century film theory, because film theory, it's debatable whether or not it started in, you know, the late 19th century with some of the theatre production plays being written, especially some of the critiques on the Lumiere's clips, and kind of, you know, the photo play, as Hugo Munsterberg may call it. We kind of assume that film theory only really began in 1910, like 1916 specifically, when Hugo Munsterberg wrote his first thing, but we'll get into that. I'm just going to get settled in. I'm going to get used to talking. Clear my throat a little bit. Get some coffee down me. And we'll get started in a quick bit. Have I sent all of the live stuff? Yes? So, I'm not going to, because I have got a few questions, I'm not going to discuss the questions from the previous film practice lectures here. I'm going to be doing that at the start of the next stream. I do have some kind of privately asked questions, because they didn't want to leave comments, which is fair. You can do that. But I won't be answering them this stream, just to keep everything kind of neatly organised, because it doesn't make sense if people are only interested in theory or practical and they don't want to turn up for any theory, because I understand this stuff's boring. It's not for everyone. And what I'm going to give you is just kind of a really watered down, really quick, kind of non-substantial version of film theory history, rather than film theory specifically. I'll go more into depth in the area that I took more attention in, which is realism. So for those of you who don't know, because I've never really said it, I've never really specified this, I can't go too much into what I'm writing because I will dox myself if I'm not careful. A lot of my writings focus around reality, realism, and kind of the research therein of kind of the illusion. So I've recently been reading Richard Allen's book on illusions. What's it called? realizing illusion or something. I can't exactly remember now, but it's dumb because I am reading it like right now. But yeah, so I focus on a lot of like reality stuff, like the writings of Andre Bazin, who we'll talk about later today. I have started to research more into theatre, sort of like the theatre's like theory side of stuff like Bertolt Brecht. That is my area of expertise, so there's going to be a lot of this stuff that I kind of gloss over. It's not because I'm trying to withhold information for my own sake, it's just because I don't know enough to accurately tell you everything. I'm doing a lot of research and putting a lot of time into these things, but I am rewriting a lot of it just to make sure all of it's coherent. So, with that out of the way, I'll wait for it. How long is it till 7:20? 35 seconds. Well, that's fine. So, film theory is very expensive, and I'm going to explain this in a little bit, but just to let you know that a lot of this will just be basic rundowns. Don't expect me to go into detail about everything. If you want me to, you can always ask questions during the stream, or I will happily respond to you after the stream in the comment section. If you weren't able to catch this live, don't worry. I will be doing a super edit of all of this later. There will be stuff I want to show you in between streams, but I wanted to show you videos somewhere between this. I don't know if I will, because showing videos is kind of tricky, and I don't want this to flag up in any algorithm. So, we'll see. Maybe I'll save the video excerpts for like the videos I'm going to edit together to make them give them more sense. But yeah, so it is 7:20. I'm not going to dally anymore. Let's jump right into the first slide. This is Film Theory, an introduction, lesson 1, early film theory. So, basic film theory and where to start. You can't see, I'm going to crouch down. Oh, you can't see it. So I have tried, I have tried keeping myself small. I think it's probably best I just move myself over here a little bit more, because I don't want to interrupt a lot of the words. There is a lot of information in these kind of early slides, kind of around here, so I don't want to be covering them. So I might jump around a little bit. I'm sorry for future me editing, and I'm sorry for anyone who likes their VTubers to stay in one place. I did want to have myself over in the blue corner, because I do look much better over here, but I would cover a lot of the information, so I have gone back here. Anyway, enough moving. People do get sick of that. I'm sorry. I'm trying to figure out how to give myself a thicker outline. I am also just making a new thing, but that's a whole different thing. Anyway, you're here for theory. Or maybe you're here for something else, I don't know. If you're lost, there is a map. Anyway, where to start? Film theory is very broad. Like, yeah, insanely broad. So, I covered this a bit earlier, but film theory is heavily expensive. To say it, film theory is not always just film theory. Film theory is film theory, film philosophy, film psychology. It is, as I said in the lesson series 0 and also last lesson in film practice, film theory is kind of the yes, sorry, I got a message on Discord. Film theory is kind of the how do I put this? Sorry, I got distracted by Discord. Let me start this again. Film theory is broad. It is insanely broad. Film theory is all about like practical theory, it's philosophy, it's psychology. Later on in the mid-20th century, we will look over psychoanalysis methods, which I hinted to before as being kind of something that was basically taking the writings of Jacques Lacan and Sigmund Freud, and kind of attaching them to methods of witnessing information. So, film theory is very speculative. It's art theory. At the end of the day, film theory is just a wing of art theory, and art theory is massive. I mean, huge. There's theories on painting, on art and poetry, on just everything. So to say film theory is broad is like really reductive, because it's just one wing of a massive like other art beast, like art theory beast. And it is all tied to theory and philosophy and psychology, because that makes up a large portion of how we understand certain things. Film theory is actually so insanely broad, and there's so much to cover, as I've just hinted at, that I can't do enough in 4 lessons, which is why what I'm doing right now is kind of doing a taster of all of these things, and then later on, when I personally do my own research, I will go into specifics. Like, I have I have tons of ideas for specific, classes. I want to talk more about Japanese cinema and the styles of dadaism. I mean, they're 2 separate things, but you get what I mean. So I want to talk more in theory later on and kind of do more specific classes, but this is just to kind of test the waters, see what people like, see what people don't like, and if you want it, I'll write more. I'll make more of this. This will just be a basic rundown of theories, who said them, and their importance. So what I mean by this is I will be giving you the starter recipe on where to look for more information and where to go. I'm hoping that this kind of gives you that urge to look for more. So if you like anything that you hear from here, I can actually hand you some more information for you to do your own research, and you can figure out where to research from here, but I'll just be giving you a basic, starting point. It is not a comprehensive list. There will be people I miss out. There will be people like Ian Christie or Noel Carroll who have talked about these theories from the early 20th century, and I won't talk about them. I'll be talking more about Noel Carroll sometime in the kind of mid 20th century lessons and then late 20th century lessons, but realistically I'm going to be keeping this very broad because, or very kind of not broad, I should say, because I want to focus in on some of the biggest names, some of the more why we got to where we are kind of things. A lot of film theory, as I said earlier, is based on philosophy and psychology. It's how we understand the basic grasps of what we, see film theory as. It's the basis of film theory is psychology and philosophy. People joke and say, "What is a film?" And it's true. It is true. That is a valid question. What is a film? What is a film? What is a film? This will be more of a historical timeline, as I said earlier, of just stuff, film theory, and how we came to this, conclusion than it will be like a full run through. Again, I'll go through more kind of specific lessons when and if I want to. This is just to test the water. Additional readings aren't essential. I will not be assigning you homework, but they do help. I won't be assigning you homework, as I just said, but I will point you towards readings if you're interested. I think you can tell this isn't rehearsed nearly as much as it should be. I will do better for the next time. I'm sorry if this is wild to keep a hold of right now. So let's go through a rundown of what happened during the 20th century, the early 20th century theory, and how it came to be. Film theory's roots are shared with art and theatre, so a lot of film theory's early kind of writing and basis comes from the theory of theatre. So a lot of the audience was borrowed from the way that we see film, kind of cinema, and so a lot of the audience theory came from theatre, and we got a lot of our understanding from theatre. So that's where we've come from. And that isn't to say that theatre is a basis for film theory, it just helped it get kick-started. The way in which we enjoyed theatre, and the way the audiences participated with theatre, was put onto early audiences of film theory. And the main contributors to early 20th century attached the theories of film theatre to write brand new theories. So they used these existing theories to come up with philosophical, and psychological kind of reasonings as to why film could be the way that it is. A lot of these lines were abandoned, especially by the mid-20th century, but theatre and a lot of art theory really helped get film theory started. The theories mostly discussed were reality and realism, which was championed by many, but I'm going to put Andre Bazin here because he talks specifically quite a lot about realism. The Audience of Film and Theatre, which is discussed again by many people. I mean, Hugo Munsterberg talks about it, but it's mainly also talked about basically talked about by Rudolf Arnheim. The Shot and Film Forms, which was talked about by Sergei Eisenstein and Vsevolod Budovkin. Editing Practices, well, and Sergei Eisenstein and Vsevolod Budovkin. And Film Psychology and Philosophy. I don't know why I had such a hard time reading that word. And that was Hugo Munsterberg. Now, they had their fingers in all of the pies here. So, really, like, it's not fair to say that all of these people wrote just about these things. They kind of wrote all about these things. Bazin himself talked about, like, the shot and the composition fairly frequently. He talked about a lot of film style, and without Andre Bazin, we wouldn't have a lot of our, I would say, early to mid 20th century revelations. So to say he really only did realism and reality is reductive of the bigger things that Andre Bazin contributed to. But for the sake of this PowerPoint, these are kind of the main points that some of these people talk about. Like, for example, editing practices was talked about not just by Vsevolod Budovkin, but also Sergei Eisenstein. I mean, Sergei Eisenstein pioneered the Soviet montage, but we'll talk more about the Soviet montage in a second. If all of this is a little much, don't worry. We will go through all of this through the course of this lesson. So first we start off with Hugo Munsterberg, considered by many to be the first film theorist. I know my model keeps frog blinking. I am trying to fix that. My rigging needs whole new work. So you can't see it because I'm big-headed, but there we go. Hugo Munsterberg and the first film theory. Let's make myself slightly smaller. Okay, so this was a mess of a slide. I wasn't very prepared for this stream. I was very tempted to push it forward, but we are here now. Let us begin. Film theory as we know it really stemmed from the beginning writings of Hugo Munsterberg, who was a Harvard-trained psychologist and philosopher. I believe he focused in many things, not just film. I think film was just something he became known for later. And people are messaging me. I'm going to put my phone down. Hello, phone. My phone is buzzing, and you will go over there. So, Munsterberg wrote a book in 1916 called The Photoplay, a Psychological Study. I keep wanting to say psychoanalytical. It's a psychological study. The photoplay in this case was used to refer to films. He talks actually in depth about Eduard Muybridge, who actually recorded one of the first, technically first films that we ever saw. So, in my film practice lesson a couple of days ago, I talked about Edward Muybridge, and to bring you up to speed with who he was, he recorded a horse galloping in about 1886, I believe. And Edward Muybridge was kind of seen as the first filmmaker because he had a run of cameras all in a straight line and basically had them set to take one picture, one after the other, of this running horse. And then he overlaid all the pictures in a zoetrope, which is a spinning kind of like carousel thing that you spin at a specific speed and you look through this kind of slit with lights coming up, and it shows you a moving image. And it was technically the first set of photographs ever made into a film. It's not considered true first film because it's a collage of images. But then again, we get into this philosophy question of, is it the first film? Has everything else been an imitation? Because truthfully, we don't have really, I mean, we have discussed this at length, but the truth is that film theory is, very philosophical. Could it be that a film we've lost track of what a film is by just becoming so modern in it. But, that's a bigger question for another day. This is meant to be tiny, so now you know who Edward Muybridge is. Munsterberg talked a lot about Muybridge because this was a book made in 1916. That is about 110 years ago. So the first film theory ever made was written 110 years ago. And by this point, the first film with sound hadn't yet come out, because the first film with sound was technically The Jazz Singer in 1920, I want to say 1929. So up until this point, all films were silent still. So Munsterberg wrote a lot of his theory based on the theatre and combining kind of this view he had of the theatre and his cinema. So in his book, Munsterberg completely defines what theatre is. He lays down the psychological background for film. He lays down the psychology and the philosophy of film and the audience, specifically how we perceive the film. He talks a lot about kind of its nature as art and the social status we have when, we go and see this. Because back during this time, there was this kind of negative connotation with seeing a cinema film, going to see a moving picture than there was going to see a theatre. We'll talk about this in a little later, but the rundown of it is people, even to this day, still say that going to see a theatre production is more respectable than going to see a film. And this was a big thing back then. But moving on. Hugo Munsterberg is not one of the first people to talk about the term plastics. Plastics in relation to art is incredibly old. We've been talking about the plastics for many years, ever since the Greeks. So the plastics, to give you a rundown, because I'm going to say plastics a lot, especially over this lesson and the next lesson, because André Bazin uses the term plastics a lot. Plastics is working with anything physical, like clay or, sculpting out of rock. That is what we mean by plastic arts, something tangible and realized, physical that we can work with. Plastics then just became to mean realism, kind of. It's vague, but we use the term plastics now in the forms of realism. So Munsterberg brings up this theory of the plastics and how we see this flat image of a photograph. So he talks specifically about the 3D nature of plays. We see the actors on stage, we hear their boots on the floor, we hear them project their voice through an echoey hall. But with film, we don't hear that. With film, what we see is this flat image projected onto a kind of wall or a screen. Is that 3D? Is that realism? So his book kind of talks about... oh, why is that disappear? That's very odd. I don't know why you do that. But he talks about the technological aspect of film and kind of the way in which it's captured, and then discusses the way in which it's not plastic, but still captures a reality. So he brings up this he brings up this question of, film captures reality. It captures reality better than perhaps actors on a stage could, because it is actually recording a scene. But it's not realistic. Is it realistic? That's his question for the whole of this book, is talking about the technological and kind of the implications of the psychology and the philosophy of film as a 2D flat-screened medium compared to the plastic arts of theatre. I don't know why you do that. Just PowerPoint things. So Munsterberg states, and don't be afraid of this wall of text, the photoplay tells us the human story by overcoming the forms of the outer world, namely space, time and causality, and by adjusting the events of the former to the inner world, namely attention, memory and imagination and emotion. Big quote. In this quote, I've written a lot of what I was going to say out loud down, which is why I'm trying to get better at it. So to give you some context, in this quote, Munsterberg specifically states that the inner refers to... So when he says the inner, he talks about the stylistic development of the film, the technique, the styles chosen, the formalist styles. And he refers to the outer as like the technology that came before. So he specifically mentions the space-time and causality. And by adjusting the events of this, forms the inner world, namely the attention, memory, and imagination, emotion. So by using the effects of the outer world and using the technique, we get to the inner world, which is all about like the stylistic development of the film. I'm really bad at compacting all this together. In fact, I have actually just paraphrased Robert Stamm from his Film Theory and Introduction book, which is a fantastic book. I do suggest you read that if you really want to get into film theory. He is a bit heavy on the words, so if you want more of a kind of crushed down reading of this, what Munsterberg is basically saying here is, by using this style, by using stylistic choices and choosing to manipulate forms of like space-time and story and narrative, we come up with something that can give us an imagination that grips us. So it basically, like, he's just saying that by watching a film, we imagine it. So this is the groundwork of what would then become psychoanalysis. This is basically psychoanalysis beginnings, but he doesn't take any of the psychoanalysis readings or writings of Jacques Lacan and Sigmund Freud yet. This is purely just on the basis of psychology and philosophy as he knows it. And it's incredibly helpful because it sets up the basis of what we know as film psychology. Next we have more Munsterberg. Munsterberg became kind of fascinated with the inner side of film, specifically the psychology of the audience, the spectator, and how we perceive this new reality. This is what Robert Stamm... I know this is another wall of block text, but stick with me, I'll explain it. Robert Stamm explains it like this. Working out of the tradition of philosophical idealism, where thought shapes reality, Munsterberg argues that film reconfigures three-dimensional reality according to the laws of thought. Unlike theatre, the cinema creates pleasure by triumphing over... I'm sorry I'm reading that wrong. Over the material principle, freeing the palpable world from the heaviness of space, time, and causality, decking it out instead of in the forms of our own consciousness. Yeah, this is why Stamm is a fascinating read. He's just really heavy on the words. What this basically all means is that Munsterberg breaks down the film into its psychological and philosophical components. He says that by watching it, we understand it's a 3D environment just caught in 2D. So he's saying that we understand the way that this is captured and presented to us is a form of reality. So a good example to bring up, something I mentioned in the last lesson, is when the Millionaire brothers, I can't say the word anymore. When the Millionaire brothers, Luminaire, not Millionaire, Luminaire, my brain is short-circuiting, apologies. When the Luminaire brothers recorded a train coming into a station in 1898 or 1980 something, a lot of people jumped behind chairs because they thought the train was actually coming towards them. Naturally, we know a photograph. We know a photograph is the physical capture of light on an image, and we know it's a depiction of reality. So when we see a film of a train coming towards us, we immediately think that's real. So what Munsterberg is basically saying by this is that we know that this is, even though it's a flat image, we know it's realistic, we know it's real, we know it was there and it happened. But we shouldn't, because it's 2D, but we give into it our faith of believability because we know it's real. We can see the depth through this image, through this video. So what it does, what we do specifically when he says, unlike theatre, the cinema creates pleasure by triumphing over the material principle, freeing it from the palpable world of its heaviness in space and time and causality. What he means by this, specifically, is... how do I put this? Theatre can only do so much to give us an impression of realism. Something that Bertolt Brecht actually talks about in his writings of theatre from 1940 is that the action of the actors have to impart realism. But when you record a film, you don't have that, because you have the reality already. You have that in front of you. So a lot of Munsterberg is just breaking down a lot of film into its psychological, philosophical, and technical components. He says we watch a film and we know it's realistic because we can see the detail of realism in it. And I'll explain a little bit of that a little later because it's a bit confusing. But the very basic premise of it is just captured reality versus real life. We know that is a moment captured in reality. And we can understand that. So that's basically what he says, is that despite the fact it has almost no continuity, we give a film our sense of reality because we know it's a photograph. So he talks specifically about the flat and the plastics and how, you know, the theatre is a play. We know it is a play because we know that these are actors. But when something is a photograph, we give it a specific, you know, benefit, the doubt of realism. So that's what he talks about. I have butchered this explanation, so to summarise it really simply, film is flat, but we know it to be real, because we know it's just real. We can tell it's real. A play, or a theatre play, is not real, because we know that they are actors. We cannot give a theatre the same level of realism that we can a film. So the way that we watch a theatre production and the way that we watch a film just is different. We impart different senses of realism into these actions. And that's the difference between captured reality and real life, or the flat and the plastics. Hopefully that solves that. We will talk more about the plastics and the kind of photo versus painting versus stuff in a little bit. We'll ignore this last line because I should have removed it. It makes things more complicated. We'll remove temporality, ignore it. So, I said that Hugo Munsterberg was not a film theorist, but he did write one of the first pieces on film theory. What did Munsterberg think of film? Ultimately, Munsterberg refers to film with a tempered excitement. He specifically says there's a lot of technical ability here. There's a lot of questions to do with psychology and philosophy in the terms of the audience and this new formed mention of art. He talks about the theory of art and like whether or not it is, and he recognizes film as art. This is 1916. This is about 20 years after the Millionaire Brothers released their Train video, and technically 40 years, or 30 to 40 years, before the first technical film with Edward Muybridge recording The Horse and the Buffalo. Or The Horse and the Bison, I should say. So, 30 years after its inception, 30 to 40 years, Munsterberg recognizes it as art. That's fascinating. So, I'm not going to show you that. That's a bit of a flashbang of a lot of text. We'll cover this first section first, and we'll get to that part of text in a bit. Munsterberg really loved film. He thought it was a fantastic idea, but he had a lot of tempered expectations about it. He was very reserved in his way of judgment. So he speaks rather refreshingly about the future of film, saying that it has a lot of potential. It has a lot of how do I put this? It has a lot of potential to grow as an art form, and it has a lot of promise. That's the word I was looking for. But he also said it can go wrong very quickly, and said that there's a lot of... he himself insinuated shame of seeing a film compared to seeing a theatre, which comes back to this whole audience question and classism and socialism, and socialism isn't a word, but you know what I mean. It's like this whole view of class structures and, money and wealth and the intellect of the viewer was something he discussed very briefly. It was this, potentiality that film could rot the brains of the younger generation. And he's not one of the only ones to think that. But he does ultimately recognize that film is a valid form of art. So let's cap off with this insanely long bit of text. We recognize that art is a way to overcome nature and to create out of the chaotic material of the world sometimes entirely new, entirely unreal, which embodies perfect unity and harmony. The different arts are different ways of abstracting from reality, and when we begin to analyse the psychology of the moving pictures, we soon become aware that the photoplay has a way to perform this task of art with entire originality, independent of the art of the theatre, as much as poetry is independent of music or sculpture of painting. It is an art in itself. So this is a big quote, and if you don't quite understand it, what he's basically saying here is that there is a separation of the way that film can be made. And he understands that by using the art of film to create something fake and realistic, which looks potentially unreal in some cases, we impart into it our own consciousness of art. He says it is just as much art as independent from the theatre as poetry is from music and sculpture painting. So he's specifically saying that this is separate from a lot of the bodies of other art, and we should not be tying it to theatre. That's something he specifically says. He spends half this book comparing it to theatre and then says we shouldn't compare it to theatre. I mean, it's a little more nuanced than that. Munsterberg is a bit of a hard read these days because it is he does write a lot of roundabout ways. A lot of what he says is incredibly fascinating, but he does contradict himself quite a few times. But in terms of this being the first writing on film, like film theory, this started everything. If you really want to read more into Hugo Munsterberg, I do suggest reading The Photoplay, A Psychological Study. You can read it for free online. There is a copy on the archive.org, and there is even a version up on a webpage that is just plain text for you to read. I do suggest, if you want to get into early film theory and you just want to learn how everything started, I do suggest reading this book. I would link it to you, but I don't want to tab out of everything right now. I'm in a pretty precious situation right now. Right. Oh god, I thought I was muted for a second there. I was about to say. Right. Let's continue. Rudolf Arnheim. The bitter man, as I like to call him. It's unfair to call him bitter. I have my opinions. He had massive writings to say on film. Rudolf Arnheim was technically one of the first film theorists. One of the first, but I'm not the first. Rudolf Arnheim focused explicitly on the early technology and audiences of film. Now, he focused on many other signs as well. He didn't stop writing for many years after this, but he would write pretty extensively about kind of the technological advancements, and what we're going to focus on is his Film as Art book. So, he first published this book, Film as Art, in 1933. It was then re-released and rewritten in the 60s because a lot of the translations that they did in the original 1933 release was wrong. Rudolf Arnheim, I believe, was German? Might have been Austrian. I can't honestly remember. I think it was German. And he wrote a lot of stuff in German, specifically. So there is a bit of a translation gap that needed to be redone. So in the 60s, his stuff was rewritten. So I'm specifically bringing that up because some people might think Film as Art was written in the 60s, but it was not. It was released in 1933 and was actually a combination of articles. Unlike Munsterberg, Arnheim spoke negatively about the impact and the technology of film. Now, that isn't to say he hated film. Rudolf Arnheim loved film. He thought it was just as much art as anything else. He thought it was undoubtedly art. But he said that he claims that the rapidly improving technology, because at this time in 1933 we'd already seen the first Speaky film come out, and that was The Jazz Singer in 1929, and we'd already seen Technicolor start to dominate the scene here. He talks about this rapidly improving technology as something that was now stifling and destroying creativity. He said that the addition of sound left a lot to be desired, and that there was still like art, to be found from lack of colour. How could we abuse the monochromatic nature of film? He was absolutely opposed to a lot of this film theory. I made it to the Cozy Film Yap stream. Welcome, Grape. I am a little bit in, I would say about 1/3, 1/4 in, but that's fine. We've still got plenty of time. Do not worry. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat. If not, I don't mind. You can ask them at any point later in the comments, or not at all if you don't want to. It's absolutely fine. So, yeah. Arnheim believed that sound and colour really hindered film. He said that we progressed too fast and it left a lot of the film artists in a really precarious position. A lot of his writings in this journal, in the Film as Art, specifically says that with the new improving technology, artists will be left behind and no one will want to watch a silent film without colour in the 1930s, which is true. The audience wouldn't. Artists and film directors and people who knew their stuff probably would, but for the most part, not really. The layman wouldn't. So he said that because we progressed so quickly, art got left behind, and we kind of chose to forsake art in terms of pushing a profit. So he said that there was so much more to do with lighting and monochromatic films that were yet to be experimented with, and pulled up certain examples to explain this. I believe he also brings up I believe he might bring up Dreher's, was it Dreher who did Passion of Joan of Arc? I tell you what, that's for after the stream. I'll probably add a timestamp to this and correct myself if I'm wrong. But for those of you who don't know, The Passion of Joan of Arc, which is a phenomenal film, I should have actually added it to my list of films that I suggest as notable films last week, in Friday. It's a phenomenal film, one of the best films I've ever watched. It's black and white, entirely silent, and it's gorgeous. It was made by... Goodness gracious, I actually now have to make sure I'm getting the right artist here. I tell you what, again, I'll try and get it right later. It's probably done by Dreher, and it's a phenomenal film. Regardless, lighting and monochromatic film. So Arnheim really believed that by excelling so fast, we were leaving art behind. Arnheim specifically separates the film artist from the film producers, stuff like the big companies compared to the smaller artists. To Arnheim, movie makers were at odds with film artists because they were only done to make a profit. Film artists were being abandoned in favour for money-making films, which at the time debatably was true. A lot of people didn't want to make film that was art because it wasn't doing as well in the cinema. But certain countries actually liked this. For example, this was a big thing in Hollywood. So Hollywood didn't really do much art film specifically. So Hollywood had a way of doing things, and that came, structured a lot of American films. But in terms of the French art kind of form at this point, where dadaism at this point was rife in the film community, these kind of art films were pretty typical. But with Hollywood bleeding so much into film theory of this time, and not film theory, kind of practical film kind of globally at this point, Hollywood was kind of taking over, amorphously kind of absorbing everything into its reach. Film as an art form was kind of being thrown to the wayside. So Arnheim reflects poorly on the technological advancements, blaming a lot of these technological advancements on stifling art. He also claims that the rapidly speeding technologies were rotting the brains of the audience and making them stupider and dumberer That's not true. I'm plenty of smarter at. I'm trying to force a joke here, it's not working, but anyway. Rudolf Arnheim says the following. What will the colour film have to offer when it reaches technical perfection? We know what we shall lose artistically by abandoning the black and white film. Will colour ever allow us to achieve a similar compositional precision, a similar independence of reality? There it is again. Reality. So there's that word again. So as you can see here, actually, I'm going to point this out because just in case anyone wants to, there's a wonderful book called Film Theory and Criticism. I read from the 7th edition. There I think is the 9th edition now. So my edition is from 2009. It's really outdated now, but it's still got most of the relevant theory in it. But if you want to read more theory, this Film Theory and Criticism is just a massive collection of like film theory criticism from many different people, picking out the most influential. So if you want to read up on it, Rudolf Arnheim's Film as Art is in that book, mostly. Anyway, so what does Rudolf Arnheim mean here by what should we lose artistically by abandoning the black and white film? He's saying that there's still more to be sought after. Can we truly do a compositional precision? Can we truly do kind of all the formalist precision that we can with monochromatic film? He says that what is there to gain once we get to the perfection of colour film? What is there left? Where do we go from there? He argues that by chasing this dream of perfection and immaculate kind of presentation, where is there to go? Now we can look back at this in hindsight in our current film era of 2025, which is when I'm doing this stream, by the way. We can look back at this and go, what a silly man. We have come so far. We have special effects now. We have things beyond comprehension. This was 1933. This is 90 years ago. Now imagine telling someone from 90 years ago, who was already, I think, like 50 or 60 by this point, that we're gonna have, like, anime waifus, you know? Like, tell him that we have CGI and, like, 3D animation in film and it looks realistic. Show him the newest Avengers film, watch his head explode. We can look back at Rudolf Arnheim say these things with a look of critical kind of, you know, oh, you're wrong. But at the time, he had a lot... He was basically valid to have these fears. Because film, by 1933, was 50 years old. In terms of art forms, it is our youngest art form. Well, technically, people will argue that the vlog or the internet content media production is actually the youngest now. But without film, I don't think that would have existed, and it's a bit of an offshoot. That's its own theory. As far as I'm concerned, film art and theory is one of our youngest art forms to date. One of them. So, by this point, 50 years on, was it already over? His argument that this was just a fad or a trend, and that film had so much more to give but was about to be kneecapped by a larger industry. And we've seen that to be mostly true. Because Hollywood was kind of ruining things for others. There's a reason why people don't look fondly back at Hollywood. It had a lot of very good information and details in it, and I think there was a lot Hollywood did right, but there's a lot that Hollywood did wrong. I mean, we can see this with certain films like Gojira from Japan in 1950-something. I think it's 1951, maybe 1959. That was a black and white film done with very rudimentary special effects, but it was made with love and care, and it was a sound film. Arnheim knew this to be false, because there were films made at this time that would prove him wrong if he just waited another 10 years. But at the same time, we have to ask what he meant by compositional precision. Like, what did he personally mean by this? And a lot of what Rudolf talks about is unfortunately kind of... he contradicts himself. He contradicts over himself several times. So his fears were, I would say, you know, valid, but he was very bitter about film and art and what could have been without giving it much chance for the could have been. There was not really much chance for it, and he didn't really give it much of a thought. So I'm just going to load up all of this because I don't know why this quote isn't hiding properly. But there it is again. Reality. The photo versus reality. Photos versus paintings. So this time in the early 20th century, a lot of film theory was talking about other arts compared to film. Be that the plastics of theatre, comparing reality to the photo, or paintings versus art versus the photo, which is the kind of, theatre versus the play versus the painting. So what was reality? A lot of philosophical talk of the early film stuff relied on the discussion of philosophy. What was the photograph? What was a film? Again, I've mentioned this several times as a joke, but it is actually a very valid question. What is realistic in terms of film? What makes a film realistic? We can ask ourselves that question now because we're in 2025. We've had over 100 years to muse this thought. We've had 150 years, really, to muse this thought, technically. I mean, that's when Edward Muybridge released the horse video, but we've had a lot of time, over 100 years, to really think about reality in this way. And a lot of people have. And a lot of people have written about realism and kind of what this means for us. So, the realism of film has always been a hotly debated kind of topic. And even to this day, authors are still trying to argue what reality is, because with every new advancement of film, our definition of what reality is changes. For example, back at this time, all we had was film, with the Lumiere brothers kind of recording the train coming towards them. Kind of, people jumped behind their seats, they were terrified of it. In the 1960s, when the BBC released Doctor Who, people thought the Daleks were real, and genuinely thought that the, alien invasion was happening. By the 1990s, with special effects, people thought Jurassic Park was real. There were plenty of people who thought Jurassic Park was actually, done with real dinosaurs. It was a massive thing at my primary school when I was 8 or 7 and being like, did you know there's actually a real Jurassic Park island? And we were like, no way, bro. That's just what life was. And we thought about it when we were kids. But that's when you're a kid. A lot of people who were older genuinely thought that there were dinosaurs recorded in that, or some weird green screen trickery. It was fantastic. It was peak cutting edge kind of special effects at the time. I mean, nowadays you can watch Jurassic Park and kind of see some of the cracks, but in terms of reality, we've really progressed. I used the Avengers kind of films. I don't enjoy them personally. I don't like superhero films, but I'm not critiquing anyone who likes them. I'm just saying that, it's not my thing. So my knowledge of them is kind of a little bit skewed. But I will say that their special effects are top notch. The one scene where you see kind of Thanos sitting over this whole area and he pans over this field, it's phenomenal. I won't say more than that, but it's all CG. All of it's CGI. None of it's realistic. So you have to really think, what is reality nowadays that we can have, special effects that genuinely look realistic, that portray a fake reality? So this talk of reality versus film is still ongoing to this day and will likely never stop. It's one of those continuously reoccurring questions of what is reality? There will never be one theory that shuts everyone up. And that's kind of where this problem comes from. So very early on, we were talking about the painting and kind of comparing film and pictures specifically to the painting. So here's what Rudolf Arnheim says about this subject. The masterpieces of painting prove that colour provides wider possibilities than black and white, and at the same time permits a very exact and genuine style. But can painting and colour photography be compared? Whereas the painter has a perfectly free hand with colour and form in presenting nature, photography is obliged to record mechanically the light values of physical reality. So, coffee. So, what he's saying here is basically, though film can be done in colour, and therefore imparts into us a more realistic vision, is it genuine? Is it more genuine or less genuine than a picture or a painting? Because a painting can be used, colour in a painting gives off a whole new range of like reality and realism possibilities and stylistic possibilities, but the photograph is limited to what it can physically capture in reality. Enter Andre Bazin. As you might know, I have a bit of a hard-on for Bazin, to put it lightly. I love this man's theories. I eat them up like cereal, but I know he has his problems. Before anyone says anything, I know. Bazin has written extensively about realism. I mean, it's not just the thing he writes about, but he has written extensively about realism, and one of the things he writes about in one of his pieces is writing about the photo and reality and paintings. To Bazin, the way the media is created affects our way of analysing it. So the way that we are presented the piece of creative art is, changes our perception of it. He specifically goes on to say, the moment the human hand is introduced during replication, we psychologically cannot see it as real, and we know it to be a recreation made by man, made by humans. We know that a painting is a painting, so when we see a painting, like for example the Mona Lisa, even though it looks realistic, we know it's a painting. We know it can't be real. It is in some way a recreation. We know this. The hand of the human has touched this, has painted it. We understand that this is false. It is not real. It's reality. It's kind of depicting a woman, but not real. It's a painting. We psychologically give it the ideology of a painting. That's kind of the thing. Whereas photography enjoys a certain advantage in virtue of this transference of reality from the thing to its reproduction. A very faithful drawing may actually tell us more about the model, but despite the promptings of our critical intelligence, it will never have the irrational power of the photograph to bear away our faith. What does this mean? What does he mean by this? Take, for example, a painted theatre set. If we see a theatre play in a theatre production, but they have a painted backdrop, say painted trees, painted mountains, we can tell that it's a painting. We know it's a painting, we are looking at a painting, therefore it is human-made and therefore not as realistic as a photograph. So the paintings may have, a better colour understanding of the mountains and the gradients of the stones. You might be able to see the stones in the kind of like on the side of the ridges of the mountain. Or another example, if we look at Bob Ross paintings, we can see the way in which he draws like the trees, the happy little trees, and we see the way that he, creates them and presents them in a way that is, it looks realistic, but because it's a painting, we already know that vista does not exist. Whereas a picture, we know a picture to be realistic because we understand a picture is a capture of reality. We've gone out with our camera and taken a picture of a rolling, vista with mountains, rivers, trees. We have captured the picture and we can see the picture. We can see the detail of the 3D, even if that picture does not exist. Even if that picture is so under-detailed that we can't give it, enough faith, we still trust it over the painting. A good example of this, and I will try my best to bring this up quickly, is... God, I have to be very careful here. Is this. That is massive. So, give me a moment. Give me a moment. I didn't expect that to be so large. Right here. This is a picture. That was scuffed as shit. But this is a picture. It's one of the first... Stop it, you. This is one of the first pictures ever taken. Now, not the first picture, I don't think. This is one of them. This is the view out of some, I don't want to say some French village. It's the view of a French village of over a certain date. I think 1830 or 1828 or something. 1829, I believe. Anyway, the reason I did this entirely scuffed thing is because I wanted to show you... Oh, it actually says here, point de vue, Nipsey? I can't honestly tell you, I'm really sorry. But this is a picture. When you look at this, some people will say yes, some people will say no, but do you give this picture more faith than a painting? Realistically, you would say yes. But the people I would know would say yes, because this is a picture. It looks like a picture. And it's the same thing with, say, you know, this. This is a picture of London denizens from 1989, I believe. This is a photo taken in London in the late 19th century. And we look at this and we already know it's realistic. We look at this picture and say, that is real. But we don't look at photos or like paintings and say the same thing. We know the painting is fake, even if the painting looks incredibly realistic, has all the hallmarks of a realistic painting. Because it's a painting, we understand that it's been drawn by the human hand and cannot be real. Whereas a picture is done mechanically via a camera, and it is considered a mechanical process that we have almost no interaction making. And that is why they look realistic. So I'm going to hide those. So, yeah. We have taken this theatre set. Now imagine that the painted backdrops are gone and they're replaced with a photo. We are more likely to believe the scenario of the theatre play because of the picture in the background. But this is a trick scenario. Because as I've said before, a theatre production, we cannot give it the same sense of reality that a film can. Because a theatre play is a play. We know it to be a play. We know the people behind it aren't actually, you know, the people who are in Les Miserables, for example. We know they aren't them. We know they're actors. We know they're acting. But we go there to watch a play because we understand that these are people acting. We know they are not these people. So that is the difference. Now, that's a very kind of condensed, one-sided argument of this whole photo versus painting versus reality topic. But we're not quite over yet. For many theorists during this time, capturing a moment to be replayed forever was magical, because up until this point, we had, well, theatre plays, and theatre plays were never the same each night. They could never repeat itself the same way, the same step for step, the same moment for moment. It always was different. Words were said with different pauses, with different intonations, and different, you know, things. It's like where you can't do the same stream twice. If I was to do this stream again, I would say completely different things. But because I've recorded this, and I'm playing it back, it's going to be the same way each and every time. So this was a big draw of like recording film at the time, and you actually found that some of the play was sometimes film, like early films were just recordings of plays, and then they would just play it back silently. Some people considered this inferior ways to view plays, but it was cheaper and more accessible to the lower social standings, who couldn't afford such luxuries as, you know, theatre. But even the theatre, as stated before, is limited by human error, or human error. I love that word. The human error. Because it is theatre. It is acting. We understand it to be acting. We cannot put into it our ultimate faith of reality. Now, Bertolt Brecht actually talks about theatre, and he talks about the desire not to capture realism in the way that film would, but he specifically states that he wants to capture reality in the way that he wants these situations to be believable. He knows a play is a play. He knows it's a fictitious thing. He knows that it's impossible to capture reality, so he implants into it the human nature. And that's why Bertolt Brecht does a lot of his theatre plays like this. So, in terms of capturing the reality, plays and theatre specifically asks to capture the human nature. In comparison, films could be repeated time and time again. They were, well, films. They were repeating forever in the same way. So this begs the question, after all this thought in the early 20th century, which medium is better, film or theatre? The answer is this. There isn't one. There isn't one answer to this. This opinion would be torn for many years. Today, we even still have opinions that theatre is more upmarket. And by that I mean more kind of posh. It's reserved for, the upper class. Theatre's still seen as an upper class enjoyment. Same with operas. Theatre and opera have kind of become lumped in the same little bracket, just of higher class viewing. And we still have this classist view to this day. People are still arguing which one's better, film or theatre. But as Hugo Munsterberg said earlier, there is no similarity between film and cinema. They're both different entities. They're both different forms of art to be enjoyed. So realistically, the answer is there is no answer, because you shouldn't be comparing the two. At least that's what I want to say, but people will still argue about this and still say that, one's better than the other, one's more upmarket, my thing's better than your thing. That's what they will do. But this leads on to a very interesting kind of socio-economic question. During this time, theatre and films had a quasi-rivalry. As I said before, they're different art forms and shouldn't really be, compared, as what Munsterberg said, but people still do. Many theatre enjoyers really saw film as this lower class enjoyment. Like, they saw it as this kind of thing for the poor, the thing if you couldn't afford the theatre, you would go to see a cinema production, you would go and see a film instead. And sometimes that's still the case. You get a bit more of an overlap these days, but these days people do still see theatre as this kind of separate higher class entity, as I just said. But back in those days, if you had to see a theatre play in the cinema where the tickets were cheaper, you were often seen as the lower run of society. And there was this kind of classist view of early audiences. Munsterberg himself is said to have been embarrassed with going and watching the films in the cinema. Now, I couldn't really find much information on this. It specifically says a very unassuming line about it in Film Theory and Introduction. Now, I'm assuming this means Hugo Munsterberg, but specifically, Robert Stamm says the following. The author was ashamed to be seen at the movies. So whether or not that means Munsterberg, because I'm sure he might have said Munsterberg, but maybe he, meant that's Munsterberg as the author, I don't quite know. So I'm assuming it to be the truth, but do keep in mind I can't validate this point. So even Munsterberg was supposedly embarrassed of going to see the films in the cinema, but he is said to have a very small film corpus to work from, which is why his influential 1916 study is so impressive to me, is that he had worked on so little films at the time, but still made an incredibly kind of pronounced decision on film theory. Film tickets were often cheaper than theatre tickets and were thus more accessible to the lower class. But many of the people, specifically Ian Christie writes about this in his 1980s book, I believe. The quality of the cinema after filmgoers and the quality of the theatres after theatregoers. And he comments on the kind of intellect at play and kind of the state, the griminess, the state of the buildings. But I don't think that's entirely fair, because it's a very classist view to have on cinema. But even then, it's still prevalent to this day, and it sucks that it is, because, I wish it wasn't, but this is still a classist topic. And a lot of people back then really thought that if you went to see a cinema, you were too stupid to understand and comprehend the theatre. So there is a lot of talk about studying the audience of film, which is what Rudolf Arnheim does, and it's what Munsterberg does a lot. I say Munsterberg, I mean Munsterberg. If I say Munsterberg, assume I mean Munsterberg. I'm very sorry. So yeah, that's studying the audience. There's a bit more to this. It's believed that, some people did believe that without the temporality and structure that films failed to portray, they only existed to rot the minds of the audience that watched it. It was kind of seen as this kind of lower factor. People were considered stupid if they were following films because they were going to be brain rotted. It was, a lot of people considered it to be less tangible and therefore more unenjoyable than a theatre. The pantomime, specifically, Hugo Munsterberg mentions he himself mentions the pantomime and how we've come to enjoy theatre because we enjoy the pantomime. But with film, we don't get that interaction. We sit down, we watch it in silence, and we watch the film. There's no audience participation. There's no sense of laughing with each other and pointing at the film, even though people do laugh and watch films together for the sake of enjoying films together. There was this kind of sense of community that people argued were being lost when it came to the cinema that you had with theatre, and that was kind of this big understanding of the audience. This stigma would slowly dissipate over time, but there is still a debate held by many about the quality of the audience versus the theatre and what benefits they do and don't have when compared to each other to this day. From this point on, from about the mid-1920s onwards, early to mid-1920s, we would start to see psychological analysis attached to a lot of these audiences, and also a lot of class and socialism aspects, one of which was Marxism. But before we can talk about that, because I jumped ahead a little bit, we must talk about formalist film theory. So formalist film theory was made popular thanks to a lot of Hollywood thought. But it wasn't just Hollywood thought. Film formalism is a style of filmmaking that focuses on the following. Proper lighting techniques. We actually saw Rudolf Arnheim talk about three-point lighting before. Emotional mood score, so by that it means like music that fits the mood, fits the tone, fits the scene. We're talking about music that really kind of matches its environment to give an elevated mood. Continuity, proper continuity practices like matching on action and making sure the shots all look the same between certain, cuts. The editing, which was really influenced by the Soviet montage era of filmmaking, Sergei Eisenstein and Vsevolod Budovkin, for example. Shot composition, which Bazin talks about, and stuff like the mise en scène, which is about the... So shot composition is the way in which the shot is aligned, sort of like all the buildings, the rule of thirds, for example. I mean, there's more to it than that, but that's the basic rundown. The mise en scène is like the way that this set is designed, or the way it's kind of laid out, where you would have a set of a table, for example, sitting at a table or sitting at a desk, and you may have a burnt cigar and an ashtray and like an open file with a half-drunk whiskey glass and maybe the actor will be resting on their hand. This is kind of the mise en scène, when you convey through the scene what the story is. You can tell that perhaps this detective is tired, or he maybe just likes to drink during work. But through the action of the scene, the actor, and the way that the set is dressed, you can tell a lot of sneaky little side stories by just that one shot. So film formalism focuses on these aspects here. There are many more, but this is kind of the main one that it focuses on. And it was championed by Munsterberg, Arnheim, Sergei Eisenstein, Bela Balash, and Andre Bazin, and way more. So if you read the basic Wikipedia article, on this, because I accidentally found out that basically I copied this word for word, but a lot of these writers, a lot of these theorists all wrote about film formalism, like formalist film theory. And each one talks about different aspects. For example, Munsterberg talks about the technology, the continuity, the lighting and shot composition. Rudolf Arnheim talks about the lighting techniques and the kind of emotionally mood-impacting moments and the shot composition. Sergei Eisenstein talks a lot about the continuity in the editing, as well as kind of the face of man, the kind of mise en scène, the composition of like getting the actor's face in. We'll talk about more about the Soviet montage in a little bit, and we'll talk about Bela Balash and the face of man. We'll get to that. André Bazin talks about shot composition, continuity in the mise en scène, and many, many more helped build up this theory of formalism in the early 20th century. So let's now talk about the Soviet montage and why it's so important about film theory, why it's so imperative for us. Soviet montage is considered by many to be the birth of film. It's considered kind of film editing specifically. It's meant to be seen as kind of the start of editing. It was heavily inspired by Marxist theory. I mean, Bela Balash was himself a Marxist. So a lot of this is inspired by semi-communist themes. Bela Balash was a Hungarian film critic and writer at the time, and wrote about many things from formalist film theory. He wrote from a purely Marxist standpoint, and he's written some works as The Close-Up and The Face of Man, both of which focus on kind of the way that we, would position a camera. So one of the good examples of this is during the stairway scene in Sergei Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin. We see kind of the close-up reactions and the kind of, when the action is happening, it cuts to people and their reactions of it. That is the close-up, while also encompassing what he talks about in The Face of Man. So what he talks about in The Face of Man is purely kind of letting the action of the actor, so the facial expression, the mood or the emotion and the movement of the actor talk instead of word. So he said the face of man is specifically what we get when we give it the face of the human, and that's what makes it believable. Then we have Sergei Eisenstein, a Soviet filmmaker. He was the pioneer for the Soviet montage, and he was one of the ones that wrote a lot about editing theory and practice. So a lot of this stuff about video editing comes from him. We kind of non-uniformly agree that he's the father of video editing. It's not quite that simple. He's not the first one to have done video editing, nor is he the first one to really do much editing in general, but he's the first one to do kind of more contemporary versions of editing. I mean, again, watch Battleship Potemkin. He was a filmmaker, director, and video editor, as we already know, and he is most well known for doing Battleship Potemkin from 1925. And then we have Vsevolod Budovkin, who was a Soviet filmmaker and actor during this time. He also wrote about the Soviet montage and really did respect Sergei Eisenstein. A lot of what I'm going to write will make it seem like he was at odds with Sergei Eisenstein, but he really wasn't. I believe they actually were on pretty good terms. But he had a lot of opposing views to the way that Sergei Eisenstein would run his business and run his filmmaking. As I said before, he's a filmmaker and actor, so he experienced both behind the camera and in front of the camera, and saw his own edits made. And yeah, he was on both sides at that time. He is most known for Victory in 1938, Minin and Bazarsky, which I always pronounce wrong, from 1939, and Suvorov from 1941. I actually particularly like Victory and Suvorov, which I kept calling Survivor for the longest time. My apologies. I do suggest watching Victory and Suvorov if you do get a chance. I don't know why this isn't working, but alright. So now we get to Bela Balash. Bela Balash believed that capturing emotions via the close-up. So he wanted shots that deliberately hung on the human condition or the human emotion. Stuff like the shock or the vitriol or the hatred you would see in someone's face if something goes wrong. He wanted this heavy editing style to really reflect human condition, the desire of man. He talks a lot and extensively about the human condition. His views as a Marxist really did influence a lot of his writings. So his communist views were kind of bleeding into a lot of his theory. But that isn't to discredit him or his theories just because he's, a communist and a Marxist. He was a very notable name in formalist film theory, and without his writings, we probably wouldn't have a very good understanding on film theory and the condition in human nature. So he talks extensively about capturing this human condition and this human nature of, which his level of Marxism would have really helped kind of boost. Now, I don't know that much about Marxism, so I'm going to stop there. But it's important to note. Next we have Sergei Eisenstein. Soviet montage. Sergei Eisenstein discusses his theory of editing to a T. He is basically the father of the Soviet montage, and to some people's, credit, he is the father of video editing. He is considered one of the world's greatest filmmakers. Even to this day, he's considered one of our best. And his writings helped craft video editing as we know it. Whether or not you want to say he's the forefather of video editing or not, we can debate that. But his writings on the edit and the montage and where we come from here, kind of where we've come from as video editors, all stem back to his view on the way that montage should work, how the continuity should work, how we should cut from frame to frame, and what we should hang on and what we shouldn't hang on. His theories on video editing were groundbreaking. They changed the face of video editing for years to come, and even Hollywood would adopt his style of filmmaking a few years later. Eisenstein really agreed with the montage and display of the human condition through Balash. His edits were composed of quick cuts and close-ups to really emphasize this kind of chaotic nature of what was happening at the moment. And this is what Bela Balash talks about a lot. These were instrumental to making video editing as large as it was in formalist film theory. In fact, there's also Soviet formalism, which actually helps bring a basis to Hollywood formalism. Now let's talk about Vsevolod Budovkin. My apologies. Budovkin's writings on Soviet montage often did contrast and kind of oppose whatever Eisenstein usually wrote. Budovkin usually asked for more shots of the scene, more shots of the kind of background and the composition. His theories were more to focus on the styles of the editing rather than the montage itself. So he wanted to specifically look into the theory of how to edit and what you're doing to this edit rather than just editing in this specific way. It calls for more attention to the composition, the frame set, the mise en scène, the habitants of its scenes, so he wanted more kind of hangs on the environment than the human condition. That isn't to say he didn't enjoy it or he didn't himself employ this. He just called for more scenes that showed the situation and the environment rather than the human condition. Budovkin's theories are often used in conjunction with Einstein's crafts to kind of contrast them and kind of frame both of them in very different lights. Both of them together really do, as you're kind of using Bela Balash's theories kind of as a nice crumbling on top, I'm hungry, do really make the basis of modern film editing. Now we're reaching the end. By the end of the early 20th century, we were starting to change our outlook. The audience had given us all we could through theory, and we started to see a new theory emerge. But with the end of that wasn't what I wanted it to start with, but oh well. With the end of the 1930s, the world was still reeling from World War II. It hadn't ended yet, making that clear, but we were halfway through it, and things were getting hairy. We wanted a distraction, and film tickets were going cheap. Things were speeding up. We wanted a distraction, and film was the distraction. Sometimes it was just the distraction we needed. And we saw these newly emerging styles coming out across the whole world. And with these new styles and new genres, things were becoming more diverse. people had more things they wanted to watch. It wasn't just a similar old gangster film or whatever. We were starting to get horrors. We were starting to get, B-movies. We were starting to develop kind of proper in-colour films like romances and, comedies. We saw many influential films during this time. Like, we saw, I want to say Gone with the Wind. I think that was 1936. We saw many films really come into the forefront of different styles. Sci-fi films, whimsical films. And it caught more people's attention. By the mid-20th century, theorists had already exhausted every avenue to look at the audience and the way we are, enjoying films and, taking films in. So we started to go for a more psychoanalysis route. They adopted the psychoanalytic methodology used by Jacques Lacan and Sigmund Freud more frequently. That is stuff like Jacques Lacan wrote about the mirror state, and what the mirror state basically is, and I'm going to go more into detail next Monday, because we're going to be talking about this mirror state and Christian Metz and Mulvey during this time. Lacan talks about the way in which we regress when watching a film. So we regress into this childlike, baby-like mirror state, where we subconsciously reflect what the film is showing us. Psychoanalysis therapy kind of level of doing stuff. We look at the word of Sigmund Freud and we kind of analyze the way in which he taught us. So we see these kind of psychoanalytic kind of methods be attached to the audience, how we subconsciously desire and yearn. And that's kind of the Sigmund Freud area. And then we have Jacques Lacan, who talks about the way we regress and subconsciously yearn through regression. There are many other psychoanalysis methods that people talk about. Specifically, Metz brings up the mirror theory a lot, and that's kind of contested. But that's a tale for a different time. That is entering the mid-20th century. So we have the bibliography here. If you want to read any one of these books, I'll explain them really quickly. Hugo Munsterberg's The Photoplay, I really do suggest, if you want to learn more about the first film theory, and you want to learn more about rudimentary film philosophy and theory, do look at Photoplay, a psychological study. It is free to read online. Next up we have Robert Stabb's Film Theory and Introduction from 2000. This isn't free online, I don't think, but you can find copies in any library. I do suggest you take it out, give it a nice read. It's very comprehensive. It's just a bit word heavy. And then finally, if you really want to get into this kind of thing, then we have Film Theory and Criticism. I have the 7th edition book. You could probably pick up the 6th or 7th edition book fairly cheap these days. I think it's on the 9th edition now, which is a little more expensive. But yeah, that has all of the articles written as they originally were by these film theorists in them. And if you really want to follow day by day, I suggest picking it up. It's a good starting point. If you don't want to, that's absolutely fine. It's more of a kind of non-essential read. Anyway, we've reached the end. The end of Lesson 1 of Film Theory. Early film theory. Here are my final thoughts. While anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the comments, and I'll just give you my final thoughts on kind of this whole thing. Film theory in the early 20th century was strange, because a lot of people couldn't really make up their minds on how film theory was meant to progress, and whether or not that was just because of the era or, the how they were limited. It's hard to say. Early film theory really had to crawl so we could run in modern film theory, and we are in a very different reality now. Like, even by the time we get to the mid-20th century, all of the basis that we had for the early 20th century is already overwritten. The only things that really continue is this kind of theory on the theatre and realism, and that's basically it. A lot of what we were talking about with the audience evolves into psychoanalysis. So that isn't to say that Hugo Munsterberg was wrong, per se, but without his level of theories, without anyone talking about things that, Arnheim and Munsterberg and, Bazin talked about really early on, we wouldn't have had any of this theory to build a groundwork off of. And it's thanks to a lot of theatre theory and a lot of art theory that we were really able to get so far. That isn't to say without them we wouldn't have ever thought of this. I'm sure we would have done. But, yeah, film is young. In terms of art, it is one of our youngest art forms. It's fascinating just how young it is. I think the only other art form that is younger than it is perhaps, YouTube. Like online content creation, streaming. Is streaming an art form? That's the question, is online content creation. Do we count that as videography and therefore part of film theory, or do we count it as content creation and generalized media? So it would come under media theory. That's kind of the thing. Media is such a broad term for theory as well, which is why I'm kind of dreading talking about it in like 3 lessons time. But theory is broad, like media theory is broad. So is content creation just an extension of media? Or does content creation come under its own theory? And to be real honest with you, content creation has only really existed for the last 20 years. And that's about how long it took for film to get its first proper theory and delve into theory. Now, we do have the fingers on the pulses now. We have theories coming out of very, university students. So it is a question whether or not that content creation media, is that media theory, or is that art theory, is that film theory? I think it can borrow from it, much like how film theory borrows a lot from art theory and theatre theory in some regards. Content creation theory can take from, generalized film theory. I think there is something to be taken there, especially when it comes to the audience. Do we want to consider the audience different from those who would go and see a film or a theatre play? And the answer is yes, because the way that we indulge in media these days, especially stuff like TikTok and YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels, where we watch it and they're incredibly short 1-minute sets of content. We watch it kind of in bed, on the toilet, on the train, in small doses, but we absorb a lot of it at once. Are we a different audience to those who go and sit in a cinema? Ultimately, that's this whole other thing, and a whole other set of questions. But as I'm trying to tell you, film theory at this point was just questions. What is film? So if there's anything you should take away from this, it is content creation as well as film theory is broad. It's brand new. We're at the forefront of newly existing technologies sharing on the internet to worldwide viewers. Films wouldn't actually become shared across the country for years. Especially in the early 20th century, I don't think many Lumiere brothers films made it to Hollywood to be shown in America. They did, but I don't think it was until 1920s, maybe 30s even, that most films were started to be shown abroad. You had to go to these countries and really know where you had to go to see these films. But we live in a far more different time now, and you can make a film and slap it on YouTube or Vimeo and people can watch it from across the world. I could stream my own films to people in America or Japan or, Germany. And there's something miraculous about that, how we can share a massive, more massive global audience that can just, because everyone has access to a phone and an internet connection, they get access to this media. What does that mean for audience theory? Well, you might be in the right era to figure that out. So go. Do a theory. Let's read chat. It was nice to listen to you while doing pixel art. That's sick, actually. I'd like to see that pixel art. I'm going to leave it a bit. As I said at the end of the last stream and before, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them now. Or if you want to leave any questions until later, or if you're watching this in the VOD, feel free to leave a comment or a question below in the comments. Or if you want to do what some people did last time, you can directly just message me the questions and I can very happily answer them for you, and I can answer them on the stream next time I do a stream. I will be keeping theory questions to these theory lectures, so if you do ask a question and they're in the comments and I can't, I've already entered stream, I will likely answer them at the start of the next lesson. So don't worry if you can't ask questions right now. I will, after all of these are streamed, if you're watching this in like 2026 or 27 or whatever, don't worry. I will respond to you in the comments afterwards. You don't have to be there between streams. And if you're watching in the VOD, I appreciate you. And anyone who's tuned in live, thank you as well. It's actually been really fun to just yap about film theory because I do love it. I should probably prepare for these streams a little better. I wasn't as prepared as I should have been. And it was pretty obvious at some points, but it's the nature of this beast. I still had fun, and I'm hoping you enjoyed just listening to me yap. It's surprising how quick this was. I was expecting to spend a lot more time talking about these theories, but I just wanted to keep all of this short, because film theory is so broad that if I talked about everything to the length that I wanted to, I would be here for hours. Like, André Bazin wrote so many theories during the 30s that it was hard to keep up with them. And Rudolf Arnheim didn't just write about that one article, neither did Munsterberg. I just picked out the most culturally, theoretically important parts. Anyway, I'm going to go. So thank you for joining me, and if you are tuning into the practical lessons, I will see you on Friday. But if you're only here for theory, I will see you next Monday. I hope to be back soon.